High contrast, resulting in a relative lack of detail in the brightest and darkest areas of an image, is somewhat common with older photographs, and that's especially true when the only source for that image was a print that you had to scan, as opposed to being able to go back to the original transparency. Regardless of the reasons, fortunately, there's a tool available that can help you enhance detail in the brightest and darkest areas of a photo, and that tool is called Highlights Shadows. Now, the Highlights Shadows adjustment is not available as an adjustment layer, so in order to work non-destructively, we need to make a copy of our background image layer. To do so, you can simply drag the thumbnail for the background image layer down to the Create New Layer button. That's the blank sheet of paper icon at the bottom of the Layers panel. Once you release the mouse over that button, you'll have a background copy layer, and this allows us to work on that background copy without affecting the original pixel values, so we can always go back to that background image layer if need be. With that background copy layer created and making sure it's the active layer on the Layers panel, we can then go to the Image menu and choose Adjustments, followed by Shadows Highlights. Choosing this command will bring up the Shadows Highlights dialog, and you can see that a default adjustment has already been applied, in this case an increase in brightness for the shadows of 35%. But before I adjust the settings here, I'm going to turn on the Show More Options checkbox. At first glance, the result can be a little bit intimidating, but don't worry, the adjustment controls here are actually relatively straightforward. Let's start off with the shadows adjustment. Here we're going to be able to increase the brightness for shadows, bringing out some additional detail. I'll go ahead and increase the amount slider, and you can see that we're opening up more shadow detail. Now, not all of the shadow detail. You'll notice that I still have some areas that are black, and that's because those areas had no detail at all. And if an area is completely black, there's nothing we can do to bring out detail. The detail simply doesn't exist in the image. But we can improve the overall appearance of the photo. I'll go ahead and take that shadows amount back down to 0, and then slowly increase it, and you can see that we're opening up a fair amount of shadow detail within the photo. I'm going to apply an exaggerated adjustment here for a moment just so that you can better see the effect of the tonal width and radius sliders. The tonal width slider determines how dark an area needs to be in order for it to be considered shadows. I'll go ahead and drag the slider to the left, and you'll see that areas that are not especially dark are now being toned down. They're not being affected by the shadows amount adjustment. If I increase the tonal width, then more and more areas of the image, based on their tonality, will have that brightening effect. In this case, I want to focus the adjustment just on the really dark areas of the image, so I'll use a moderately low tonal width value. I can then adjust the radius. Now, we're focusing our adjustment on particular tonal values in the image, and as you've seen with tonal width, we're actually defining the size, as it were, of that range of tonal values. But there needs to be some degree of transition between the areas that are being adjusted and the areas that are not, and that's controlled by the radius value. If I increase the value for radius, then the transition will occur across a larger distance, and if I use a smaller value, that transition will occur across a shorter distance. Notice, however, that with a short transition, I can end up with some halos. So by the woman's shoulder and arm here, you can see there's a bit of a bright halo just outside the dark arm, and that's because the radius setting is a little bit too low, or you could also say that the adjustment is a little bit too strong. I'll go ahead and increase the value for radius, and you'll see that I get a better blending of that contrast area. Of course, in this case, my adjustment is exaggerated in the first place. I'll go ahead and tone that down just a little bit. What I'm actually more interested in this particular image are the highlights, and so I'm going to focus some more attention on the highlights adjustments. Notice that the controls here are exactly the same as those found for shadows: amount, tonal width, and radius, and they behave in exactly the same way, except that we're darkening down the brightest areas as opposed to brightening up the darkest areas of the image. I'll go ahead and increase the amount slider for highlights, and you'll notice that we start to get a little bit more detail in the woman's face. We can adjust the tonal width value so that we're seeing the effect in some of the darker areas, not just the very bright areas, but also some of those midtones. And then we'll see, as I move that amount slider for highlights back and forth, that we're seeing a fair amount of detail brought out in the woman's face. in this case requiring a relatively strong adjustment. I can then fine-tune radius as needed in order to blend the transition into the rest of the image. In this case, I don't want too high a value for radius though, because that will cause so much blending in a relatively small area of the face that I'm losing some of the effect of that highlights adjustment. So I'll keep that radius relatively small, and then I can continue fine-tuning the amount as needed. Right about there looks to be pretty good. Of course, when you're brightening up the shadows and darkening down the highlights, that can lead to a relative reduction in contrast for the overall photo. And so we can apply some adjustments to the image. Those include brightness as well as mid-tone contrast. I generally start off with mid-tone contrast between the two here, and this will affect primarily, as the name suggests, the middle tone values in the image. In other words, not the brightest highlights nor the darkest shadows. I'll increase contrast just a little bit, and then we can also affect the overall brightness of the photo. In this case, I think the image could use to be brightened up just a little bit. I don't generally worry about the black and white clip values. Generally 0.01% will be perfectly fine. This just helps to reduce the amount of detail that's lost as we increase contrast for the photo. I'll go ahead and turn off the preview checkbox so that we can see the before version of the image, and then turn on the preview checkbox, and now you can see we've opened up quite a bit of shadow detail, and perhaps more importantly, we've brought back a bit of detail in the woman's face. But overall, a very nice improvement in the image, and without much effort at all. I realize the shadows highlights dialog here with the show more options checkbox turned on can be a little bit intimidating. There are many controls here, but all of them are relatively straightforward. And so with just a little bit of attention to detail, you can really enhance the amount of information you're able to see in the brightest and darkest areas of a photo. Once you're happy with the results, you can simply click the OK button in order to apply the adjustment.